In this second from last test, we will create a group totals query to locate vendor invoice records whose invoice amounts are just under the approval amount. We will find these records by using the invoices paid table and adding criteria to locate invoice amount values close to a specific amount. Then we will count up the number of records that fall into this range, grouped by vendor. We will modify the group totals query to look for an additional approval limit. And we will review the number of records and then save the query with a count of more than one invoice per vendor. We will then use the saved query to create a second query that displays the detail for these records that are close to the approval limit. We will create a new query in the design view to analyze invoice amounts. In the query window, we will click the New button and select the design view to begin our query. We will only need one table added to our query design window. We will double-click the Invoices Paid table and add it, and then close the Show Table box. We want to see the invoice amounts for all vendors. We will add the vendor number field and the invoice amount field to our query by example grid by double-clicking on each of these fields. If we were to run the query at this point, we would see all invoice records. We want to review just a select group of invoices. These invoices are ones that come in a close range to the approval amounts that are set for our vendors. Some of our vendors have an approval amount of $1,000. We believe that a few vendors are submitting invoices that come just under this amount on a regular basis. We will add an expression to our query that will look for invoice amounts that fall in the range of $950 to $1,000. To do this, we will use the between expression, adding our range of values. In the criteria row of the invoice amount field, we type in the expression between $950 and $1,000. By running this query, we see all the invoices that fall into this range. With this list, it is hard to see if there are duplicate vendor numbers. We will return to the design view to add another feature. By clicking the View button, we are brought back to the query design view. We would like access to count the number of records that it has found for each vendor. We will change this query into a group totals query to add the group and count expressions. The Totals button on the Query toolbar will make this selection query into a group totals query. You might recognize this button as Excel's AutoSum button. When we click the button, Access adds an additional row to our Query by Example grid. We notice that the Group By option is added for all displayed fields. We do want access to Group By vendor number, so we will leave this selection as is. We will need to add another copy of either the vendor number field or the invoice amount field to our grid to include a count column. It doesn't matter which field is added. Access will find the same number of occurrences of either field for the vendor group. We will drag the vendor number field to the second column to insert it between the displayed columns. We will change the total option to count to have Access count the number of records by each vendor number. We would also like to see our results in descending order, so that the vendor with the highest number of records in this range will appear on top. Next, we will change the Group By option in the third column to the expression of where. This expression is used when you have criteria added to a group totals query. Now we will run our query. We click the Run button on the query toolbar and Access displays our records. We see that there are multiple invoice records for a couple of our vendors. We question why these records are close to the approval amount of $1,000. We may want to look more closely at the other field information to see if we can recognize anything that looks suspicious. We are going to examine further these records that fall under the $1,000 limit. But first, let's look for another approval amount. Back in the design view, it would be very easy to modify the values of our criteria field to look for records that come close to a value of another approval amount. We will substitute the numbers of 1,950 and 2,000 to look for invoice records that are close to 2,000. Once a query is designed, it is very easy to modify the query to view new results. Let's say we wanted detailed information about the records that Access found and was close to the $1,000 limit. We will run a query using the results of this group totals query to display all detailed records. First, we will re-enter the original values of 950 and 1,000. We will also eliminate the record results where the count of the records found was equal to only 1. We will enter not 1 in the vendor number count criteria. Access will eliminate records where there was just 1 record found per vendor number. When we rerun this query, we see that we are looking at records where there are multiple numbers that match the criteria. We will save this query with the name Invoices Under $1,000. We will close the query and return to the query window. We will create another query that uses this query and also adds fields from the Invoices Paid table. In the design view of a new query, we add the Invoices Paid table, and from the query group, Invoices Under $1,000. We will relate the two objects on the field of vendor number. This relationship will display records that have matching vendor numbers. We will only be viewing records for these vendors that had invoice amounts close to the $1,000 approval amount. Let's add all fields from the Invoices Paid table. We will use the shortcut method of adding all fields by double-clicking on the table's title and dragging all highlighted fields to the query grid. I would also like to display the Count of Vendor field so that we can see the number that our first query came up with that tells us how many records came close to the invoice approval amount of $1,000. We will add this field so it is displayed first. I would also like to see the count field displaying the vendors with the highest count to the lowest. We will sort this column in descending order. We will sort the invoice amount column in descending order as well. Now we are ready to run this query. When the records are displayed, we see the detailed information for all records for our vendors in our invoices under $1,000 query. Notice that for the first vendor, that all invoice records in the Invoices Paid table are in the range of $950 through $1,000. The second vendor has a similar situation. The third vendor has numerous records, and only 5 of this very large number of records fall into this range that we are looking for. We might question why 100% of these records for the first 2 vendors come close to their $1,000 approval amount. Could these be fraudulent amounts? We should look closer at the detail of the records to further investigate the information in the invoice.